Well, hi, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. I'm your host, Mike Hingson. So, wherever you are, thanks for being here and thanks for listening to us or watching us if you're observing it on YouTube. Today, we get to talk to Stacy Wells, and Stacy has a lot of experience in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world and is the co-creator and very involved in a process called Right on Race to be right on race. The first right is with a W, and the second one is right as an R-I-G-H-T. We're going to learn about that. So I'm not going to give much away or talk about it because I think it'll be more fun for Stacy to do that. At least that's the plan, right, Stacy?
That's right.
So welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. How are you?
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm doing well. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, let's start as I always like to do. Tell me a little about your growing up and some of that kind of stuff. So let's start at the beginning, as they say.
Yes. So born and raised in Minneapolis, on the South Side. Some people will know that reference. My parents had 5 children, 4 boys and then a girl. They told me the story so many times of how when my mom was pregnant, the 5th and final time, that the doctors said it's probably going to be a girl, and she did not believe it. And so and my dad did, he was like, "Yes, this is it." And they would go shopping, and he'd put in girls' clothes, or at that time it was all about like pink and yellow for girls, and my mom would promptly take it out of the basket and put in boy sorts of things, because she was like, "I don't believe it. It's not going to happen. I don't believe it." And then there I was. So really just sort of I guess, a fun, normal upbringing. Often I tried to hang out with my brothers, and they were like, "No, go away." Not because they didn't love me, but because, they were boys and they were doing what they thought were boy things. And there's, between myself and my brother, who's the closest, there's about 2.5 years. But for him, he was still big brother. And so I was just always little sister. So
on the other hand, you had 4 brothers to protect you.
Exactly. Yes. And that they did and still do.
They still do, huh?
Even when I didn't want them to, right? But yeah, it was funny. It's funny because I actually had a lot of boys growing up in my family. So my mom was an only child, and then my dad didn't have any sisters. He had 5 brothers, and there was only one other girl, like a girl cousin in that family. And so there was so many boys all the time that whenever, I was with, say, my gramps, my dad's father, it was very special because he was always dealing with boys, from his sons to his grandsons. And then he finally got a granddaughter. So that was exciting for him.
Somebody new to spoil.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, I went to college in Atlanta, to Spelman College, which is an HBCU. It's an all-female college. I went there for a year, and then I decided to transfer to Drake University, which is in Iowa. And
when were you at Drake?
I was at Drake from, oh goodness, let me think here. So I graduated from high school in 86.
Okay.
And so I was at Spelman 86, 87, and then Drake 87 to 90.
I worked on a project for the National Federation of the Blind starting in 1976. But in 1977, as part of it, I spent several months at the Iowa Commission for the Blind. Oh. And I remember there was some sort of parade that went down the street, and a lot of it was related to Drake University. So I know about Drake.
Okay. If it was in the spring, in April, it was maybe related to Drake relays. That was a big
That's
deal.
What it was.
Yep. So, and still every year they have the relays. And in the Midwest, I think it's one of the only places that has a big track and field event that rivals like the pin relays or something. But it draws people from around the country, but particularly in the upper Midwest, to the relays every year in April. So it's always a good time for students on campus, but also for guests. So yeah.
Well, I very much enjoyed the parade that morning. It was around 10 o'clock or so. I was staying in a hotel on 4th Street,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden I heard a band outside. So I went downstairs and learned what was going on and just stood there and watched it for about half hour, 45 minutes until it was over. But it was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah. Yep. Gotta love a parade.
Oh, absolutely. So for you growing up, what's your favorite childhood memory? You must have lots of fond memories and maybe
I
some that
do.
aren't so much with big brothers, but
Right.
nevertheless.
So, one of my, I have two really fond memories. So one is just really simple. We just grew up in a house of music. So not like anyone playing I mean, I played instruments, but my mom really liked music. So we all did. And so she would, play albums at that time. Um, and we might be in the backyard or sitting. We lived on a corner. And so we had steps on the side of the house, technically, and then, of course, the front. And we used the side door more often, which came in into the kitchen. And then, like, you went to the left into the kitchen and to the right into like a formal dining room. So anyways, we would maybe sit on the side steps more than we would the front, but you could hear the music outside. And so just kind of sitting out there watching the neighbors go past. And if my dad was maybe outside doing some yard work, or if we were, you know, if they were cooking in the backyard, people, my parents were really established in the neighborhood. And so they just knew everybody. And it at that time, people lived in that neighborhood for a long time and really got to know one another. So it was just fun to say hi to people, and people would stop by and see what was happening. And especially not in the winter, but in
No.
the summer, in the spring, it was just, it kind of, I think for the spring, it kind of marked sort of the summer ritual of just being outside and kind of hanging out. But the other thing is that I really remember fondly, I mentioned my gramps already, my dad's father, and every weekend, either Saturday or Sunday, he would either pick me up or my parents would drop me off, and I'd spend the entire day at his house. And part of that time, he loved Westerns and he loved baseball. So he might be watching a baseball game or watching a Western or reading a Western. And I'd be sitting at I so vividly remember this, sitting at a desk and pretending that I was doing something, right? So we had like notepads and staples and tape and all this kind, and I could sit at that desk for hours and write and doodle and just kind of be there. But before, and then his friend, because my grandmother did my grandfather and my father from Oklahoma. And when my grandfather moved to Minnesota to take a job at General Mills, my grandmother was like, I'm not moving to Minnesota. She had no interest whatsoever. So she stayed in Oklahoma, and he moved up here, and his sons eventually followed him for school. But anyways, a friend of his she'd come by and she'd make sugar cookies were sort of her specialty. So sometimes I'd help her with that, or sometimes she'd just bring them by. But before our time together was done, we'd always stop by the store and I would get a new Barbie something. So it could be
Ah,
a doll, it could be some doll clothes, it could be a Barbie house, it just depended on the weekend. And so I had all the Barbie stuff, as you can imagine. But that was just, it's such a fond memory. Not so much because we went and bought the Barbie stuff, but because I just had that time with him almost every weekend, unless we were on vacation or he was busy. And so I also got to meet other relatives. They would come by and see him. And so I got to know my family in just a different way, I think. So those are a couple of things that I just remember so fondly, and they all really kind of revolve around family, right? And just spending that time. So I don't know if you spent a lot of time with, either grandparents or, if you have siblings, if you have those kind of memories about growing up, but it was just like so carefree when I think about it.
some of those memories, not so much with grandparents, but I had a brother and my parents and so on. Of course, here's the real burning question. Did your grandfather convince you to like Westerns or baseball?
Oh, well, I kind of baseball because we would also, he also liked to go to the games occasionally.
Mm.
And so I kind of liked going to the games. I'm pretty sure that now in hindsight, that was just because of the caramel corn, and they
Uh-huh.
sense.
Okay. Well, that's
But
fair.
yeah, but I got to learn the game a little bit, and usually if we went to a game, it was with maybe a couple of my brothers or a couple of my cousins or something. So just kind of hanging out with them. Westerns, not as much,
Not
which is
as much, huh?
no. And my dad liked them too. But you know what? I did get another thing I got from him was just the joy of reading, because well into his, he died when he was 80, I think 86. He would read every day. And so, I mean, I read a lot at home, but I'd always bring a book with me over there, or might just read something. He had like the Farmer's Almanac, and I was
Mm.
uh, just like so curious about this Farmer's Almanac. And so, just the joy of reading or like casual reading, I think that some of that was probably instilled but because of the time that I spent with him.
Well, that, reading is extremely important. And I very much value reading. I do a lot of listening, but I also read books in Braille.
Sure.
And there's a difference between those two techniques, because Braille is really like your reading, whereas we both can listen to audiobooks, which in a sense is a little bit less of a dimension because you're viewing it through the interpretation of the narrator, but still just having access to a lot of books is extremely important.
Yes.
And valuing what people say.
Exactly.
And the reality is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, because a lot of writers of fiction are really trying to put their life experiences into the fiction that they write. And there are so many incredible fiction writers that do some things that we should value too. But both fiction and nonfiction are important.
Mm-hmm. I think that fiction piece, sort of that ability to escape to another world, right? Is really important. But I think about, there's just so much wonderful children's literature that's out.
Yes.
Right. Just not only the illustrations, but the storytelling and the creativity that is in them. I have a daughter who's now 18, but that was one of our favorite things was and my mom did this with my siblings and myself, was going to the library at least once a week, and then also buying books, but just to even look at the picture books and read them, and just kind of then create another story off of what we read in the book. So yeah, that's always fun.
So when you went to college, what did you major in?
So when I went to Spelman, I majored in English. And it was so I applied to a few schools, and Spelman and Drake were schools that I applied to and gotten accepted to. But one of the reasons that I chose Spelman, honestly, was less about the major, but about the experience to be at historically Black college and university. And honestly, to be in a all women's environment. So for me, those two things were really they turned out to be very critical to who I am as a person now, even though I was only there for a year. It was just so affirming and empowering. And I met some really wonderful people. So my major there was English, but ultimately I really wanted to major in communications, broadcast journalism. And so that's how I ended up at Drake. I did transfer after that first year and end up at Drake. And, sometimes in hindsight, I'm like, maybe I should have stayed at Spelman, but I can't undo that. So I'm really grateful for the experience. But Drake was great too. I met there two of my very best friends to this day, and had a really fun time and a great education. So I can't say that I love living in Iowa, but it was okay. And it wasn't as difficult for me as it was for some, because it was the Midwest again. And so I was more familiar with it than some people that came to that campus. So, but Drake is a great school. So is Spelman. So I feel honored to be alumni of both. And then I did my master's work here in the Twin Cities at the University of St. Thomas. So
moved around. Well, was Drake a better school, or a school with a more established broadcast journalism program? Was that the reason?
Yeah, they have a college of journalism. And so I was able to really, still take some other courses because of liberal arts, but really focus on that broadcast journalism piece and do some internships. And at a radio studio, I was a DJ for a semester,
There you
which
go.
was pretty cool. I had a late night show that did more kind of like slow music, and that was really fun. And was able to work on some studio productions and all of those sorts of things. So got some really great experiences being there.
So, what did you do after you graduated then from Drake? And then did you go straight into master's?
I didn't. I went to work. I worked at a television studio here in the Twin Cities, our local PBS station. And I worked on a program called Newton's Apple. If you're familiar with that, it's a science program, mostly for
Mm-hmm.
young people. And so I was doing more production sorts of things, but every once in a while they needed some on-screen talent, and in particular, folks color. And so I would do some of the on-screen things, just be like an extra in an experiment, or do some things like that, which was kind of fun too. Um, and did that for a few years. And then so that was more truly, broadcast journalism. And then I did some things in marketing and promotion. Um, all of which I enjoyed, but what I realized is one, that I really enjoy school and learning, and so I wanted to pursue an advanced degree. And when I looked at what that would be for related to communications, technically there really isn't anything. I could have done, maybe something in marketing, like an MBA. I didn't really have any interest in that. I'm a really purpose-driven sort of person, I realized. And so I want the work that I do to have a greater impact, bigger than me. And it's not about me being, sort of famous or the center of attention. I just really want to make the world a better place and sort of leave an imprint in that way. And so I did some research and kind of looked around. And another thing I was always interested in was teaching, just because I really enjoy young people. One of the other things I did when I was at the public TV station was work on a new program with young people specifically. And so I think that really got me excited about teaching. And so that's the direction I went in next. I was accepted into a program for an alternative teaching license. And then I finished my master's after that. So I got my teaching license and taught for 5 years, and then kind of started down the path of my career of education and diversity, inclusion, and equity work, and have come full circle to be working back in communications, but within a K-12 system. So kind of, putting those things together. And I still do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a consultant. So I feel like I, have been able to kind of finesse a lot of my experience and, I guess my education into doing some professional work that I enjoy.
It's always fun when you can bring it's fun when you can bring your experiences back and fit into what you're doing. So you
Mm-hmm.
get to not be a round peg in a square hole. You either change the shape of the hole or change the shape of the peg, but you make it work.
Exactly. And I just what I found is that I'm not and for better or for worse, especially as I get older, I'm not really afraid to learn something new and kind of try something different, maybe even a little bit of reinvention of myself. Like I feel like that's just growth. And as long as it's logical and it sort of builds on what I already know, then I'm like, well, why not? So I am willing to I'm pretty good with like transition and change. And so I'm willing to try out new things. And I know for some people that's really scary. And it can be a little scary, but I feel like if I don't, then I might always wonder what about? So I take sort of calculated risk, I guess, still.
Well, how did you get to the point of doing Right on Race to be Right on Race? Where did that come from? I'd love to learn more about the whole program and what that's all about.
Yeah. Well, so I do that work with a colleague, a partner, and we had just met when I was working at one of the school districts leading the equity work there, someone had connected us for me to come out and speak to a group that he was facilitating. And so we became friends, and discovered that a lot of the work that we did was very similar, and we had similar sort of passions around doing the work and complementary styles. And so we started doing that work together, kind of consulting work, going in particular to school districts. And so at the time, he was actually in Mankato. His name is Bukata Hayes, and living there and working there. And I was in the Twin Cities. But we would do a lot of work out in, more rural or outstate Minnesota, but also in the cities. So after doing a couple of years in several different facilitation sessions with businesses and schools, we were thinking about, were we really having an impact in doing sort of one-off types of, or maybe even coming back 2 or 3 times? Like, what were we making the changes that we really hoped to? And we didn't think that we were. While we thought we were doing good work, it wasn't sort of moving the needle, so to speak. And we sometimes did this work with another gentleman, Reggie. And so the three of us had been talking about some different sort of innovative things that we could do. And this idea of using a journal to help people sort of process their thoughts, in this case around race, was germinated really in some conversations the two of them had. And then they brought me in, and we started talking about what that could look like, and how would we shape that. And eventually, Reggie, the third person, he had to step away because of some other work he was doing, but we kept doing it. And so what happened was we decided we were going to put this together, and we decided it was going to be a 2-year process. So we were asking people to really commit. We opened it up to the entire community of Mankato. So anyone who wanted to come, there was no cost or anything. And we were going to gather quarterly. And in between those quarters, we were going to send them information, what we called prompts, for them to take a look at and to, in their journal, respond to them. We had some questions that they could respond to, or they could just kind of write or draw or whatever they needed to do to process what they were seeing, reading, experiencing. And then when we came together every quarter, they would be more prepared to have deeper, more meaningful conversations and sort of build relationships to have greater understanding about, basically some of the issues that we have around the disparities that we have that are related. In this case, we were talking specifically about race, and much of our audience was white people. And that's okay, because there's, we didn't say that that's what it needs to be, but that's just what it turned out to be. And if we think about the work that we have to do around, cultural competency, it really is everyone's work, and it's going to be most effective if we all come together. And so for 2 years, we had probably 75 people or so turn up every quarter to have these conversations. And I think on our listserv, we had maybe upwards of 250, 300 people that were receiving our prompts every 2 weeks. And so we just went through, we started talking about sort of the impact of race. And yes, it's a social construct, and it's very much made up, but it has real impacts every day on people's lives and livelihood. And then we kind of drew a line through race and criminal justice, race and education, race in health and wellness, race in housing and income. And then at the end of the effort, we asked them to come up with solutions for their community. Like, so you've learned all these sort of historical things and some present day things. You've examined some data. You've heard from some experts at our quarterly sessions. We'd invite in some experts to talk about it, whatever topic we were on. And then we said, so what does this mean for, not only you, but your community? Are there things that you would like to see changed? And how would you go about doing that? You've got people here from the business sector, or from education, from health, from healthcare, how would you all come together to solve some of these issues in your community, and be prepared in case anything happened, which, things are likely to happen. And so this started in 2016 and we went through 2018, and it was a great process. People really, really committed and they enjoyed it. It was a journey. We had tears and we had celebrations, and we had people angry and we had people happy. And but all of, I think we really tried to challenge people and push them, but care for them at the same time. We did, sort of a lot of research as we went. And because it was just the two of us, we were able to be nimble enough to say, I think we need to maybe change this a little bit. Maybe we're sending out too much information or not enough, or something happened today, right, in the news or this week, and we need to make sure we talk about that with this group. And so we were able to keep it sort of current. And then when it was all said and done, we kind of sat back for like 6 months and we were like, wow, we learned so much about ourselves and about the process and about this work that, and we have a useful process that we really believe in, that we decided to write a book about it. And that's where the book came from, was after. So it's a bit of a reflection of the entire process, but it's also sort of a workbook that anyone can use on their own or with a group perhaps. And we've had other groups use it. We've done this process with other groups, other organizations. But it was really it was like a labor of love. Like, we really believe in this process, and we want some people to have a tool, right? There's a lot of people doing this work and there's a lot of ways to go about it. And we don't think we're the only way. We think the work that we are doing can complement many other things. And so we just want it to be accessible to people, and for people to kind of continue learning so that we can make some changes in this world that we live in. And we talk specifically about race because that was our experience, but we've also thought about how would someone from other communities, like other intersecting things, take the same process with their expertise and use it to help people grow in learning about other areas of cultural diversity. So,
well, and that of course is a question that logically comes up. Of course, for me personally, it involves the whole issue of disabilities. Yes. We hear constantly when people talk about diversity, equity, and education, we hear about race, we hear about gender, we hear about sexual orientation, and we incredibly, very rarely ever hear about disabilities.
Yes.
And that's especially amazing since the disabilities community, or the community of persons with disabilities, is the largest community in the country by far. Mm-hmm. Yet it is the part of the community in the world that is least included and involved. How do we change that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, this is, for me, I just want to share an example about how, even though you can be doing this work, you are always learning. So I was working for the Department of Human Services for a couple of years, and the administration that I worked in, community sports, included behavioral health, and it had disability services, deaf and hard of hearing, a couple of other areas. And I realized we were planning like a quarterly meeting for employees. It was like something fun. And we had a part of one of the divisions included folks that represented indigenous populations. And there was someone who was willing to do some kind of ceremonial drumming. And I was like, oh, that would be wonderful, but then I was like, oh, if someone is, I was like, are we being inclusive? Because we have deaf and hard of hearing. And a lot of people, not only did they serve the people of Minnesota that were a part of that, but many of the people on staff identified themselves having that as a different disability. And so I was like, well, no, like maybe we shouldn't do that because they wouldn't be able to hear it. And so I went and I asked, because how else do I know? And one of the people I talked to was like, well, no, it's fine to do it. We can still feel it. And actually, particularly if it's, drums, percussion, we can feel that. So yeah, that's fine. And so just the assumption that I made, right? And what I realized is that because I didn't have anyone in my kind of close circle that was deaf or hard of hearing, it's not something that came front of mind all the time. And I'm thinking that I'm trying to be inclusive, right? I'm thinking about when I'm preparing a document, especially that's going to be shared, if it's accessible, and all those other sorts of things. But that was an area that was sort of a blind spot for me, right? And so even though I've been doing this work a really long time, I was like, oh, I've got to learn more about this, and I need to be more mindful about it. But also, to your point, I feel like it's just an area that people, for whatever reason, sort of overlook. And I think what we need to remind people is, one, I mean, there are obviously visible disabilities, but there's a lot of invisible ones.
Right.
And we should just we need to always be mindful of it, because even if we don't know, if we can't see it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if we're not finding ways to make sure that we are being inclusive of that as well, then we're really leaving out a whole swath of people. And of course, like many other things, disability is one of those, is a part of the intersectionality, right? So there's just layers for people. And I just remember, for example, at the height of COVID, the disability community was like, hey, we are being disproportionately affected by COVID, and no one is talking about it. You're talking about elderly people. You might be talking about it by race. All those things are really important, but it's important for us as well. And so I think we just have to keep sort of making it a part of the conversation. And again, like many things, it's often the people that are part of that community that are doing sort of the most, they are the ones that have to always seem to bring it up. And I would like that to change. I mean, of course, they're going to advocate for themselves, but I want other people to advocate for them in case they're not there at the table, so that we can say, we need to make sure that we're getting that information. We see it happen somewhat in K-12 a bit more because of, special ed. But I think we tend to lose it if people don't feel like they know anyone that has a disability, and it just isn't something that comes to mind. So we have to keep, we have to make sure that we keep asking about it and are curious about it, and make it as important as any other area of diversity that we're talking about.
It comes up some, but there's still so many challenges. So for example, dealing with blindness, we see all the time in the educational system, people say, well, you don't need Braille anymore because books are recorded or you can listen to them on computers. And so the result is that today, less than 10% of all people who can read Braille. And of course, the downside of that is they don't learn to spell, they don't learn to write, they grow up functionally illiterate. And the educational system, to a very large degree, supports that.
Yeah.
And they don't think through that the reality is that Braille is the means of reading and writing that blind people should use. Now, I also, in addition to that, would point out that blindness, from the definition that I use, is not just total lack of eyesight. But if you get to the point where your eyesight is diminished to the level where you can't use your eyes to accomplish everything and you have to use alternatives, you ought to be learning the techniques and the technologies that blind people use, including totally blind people, because it's the only way you're going to be as effective. If you can read large print, or you can use magnifiers to read, or closed circuit televisions, it's great, except your reading speed will be slow and you won't be able to read for long periods of time without getting headaches. Whereas a person who learns Braille and who is encouraged to learn to use and read Braille, in addition, if they have eyesight, to learning the ability to read print as they can, they'll be a much more efficient and much better reader all along the line. Yeah. I've heard so many people growing up who said, I'm a partial, that is, I've got some eyesight, and they wouldn't let me learn Braille and I didn't know any better. And I grew up not being able to read nearly as well as I could. So
Yeah.
the educational system has a lot of growing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to recognize that Braille is a true alternative to print. And I'm on a little bit of a soapbox here, but I'm also doing it to try to educate people to the fact that the reality is what you think about blindness, blind people, or anyone with disabilities
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily all there is to it. And it's important to go further.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned that about Braille because I didn't realize that people were saying that that it didn't need to be taught or that people didn't need to learn it anymore. And I think that that's ridiculous because I mean, to me, I kind of equate it to another language, first of all. But I have noticed that you don't see things in Braille all the time, right? And I feel like when I was growing up, it was much more common to see it. Now there are often places where I don't see it at all. And I would imagine, obviously, like you're saying, if people aren't learning it, then people aren't creating it, right? It just sort of fades away, and that's not okay.
And it's
And
so
yes,
much easier to produce it today than it used to be
oh,
because there's so much in an electronic format. And
yeah,
I hear what you're saying about viewing it as another language. I can see you doing that, but see, I don't view it as
okay,
another language because it's a true alternative to reading print. So is print another language?
oh,
You've
I
got to
see.
look at it the same way. The
Okay,
reality is Braille is another way of representing the same things that you see through reading. And I see through reading Braille because, as we know, see does not necessarily mean with the eyes, except for
right.
light dependent bigots who think that the only way to see is with eyes. Fun to pick on. And, it's also another way of saying, as I love to do on some of the podcasts, everyone in this world has a disability. Most of you are light dependent. You don't do well in the dark. It doesn't mean that it isn't a disability. And we should really recognize that we all have challenges and we have gifts.
Oh,
But
yeah.
Braille really isn't another language. It's another method of representing the same stuff that you get by reading.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's not necessarily a way of communicating, it's a way of receiving information.
Well, it is a way of communicating as well. I take notes in Braille. I might pass Braille to other blind people who do read Braille. It's a true way of communicating every bit as much as you using a pen or pencil and paper. And then the other part about it is, of course, we all, in theory, should learn to use keyboards and communicate through computers. But a computer and you typing on a keyboard isn't a different language. It's a different way of doing the same thing.
Okay. And so there's an actual is there an actual machine that you use to create the Braille that you're
There's several
taking notes
ways to do it. There's several ways. There are machines that do it. I can create a file on a computer and transmit it to a machine that will then provide it as a representation in Braille.
Okay.
So the thing is that you really just have to look at Braille as a true alternative, not substitute or substitution. It's a true alternative to print. It's another way of doing the same thing. And the reality is good Braille readers will read every bit as good as most good print readers because we learn to do it.
Sure. Well, that's interesting. See, I love learning new things. So I think to back to your question about how do we make the conversation about disability bigger is that we just have the conversation, right? If you have someone like yourself to talk to and ask questions, and you're obviously willing to answer the questions and like inform, that's how we learn more and become more mindful. And we just don't do that enough. Sometimes we're afraid to ask the questions, or we don't know anyone, or you don't want to engage in the conversation. But that's a really simple but very important way of because once you hear and learn about these things, you can't really like not think about them or pay attention to them. I don't think. I think then it starts to really you think about it, and it should inform your change your behavior or inform decisions that you make moving forward. So I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah, it is. It's a true another way of doing the same thing that you do. I think that the reason, personally, I believe that the biggest reason that disabilities aren't included is we're taught to fear them. We're taught to fear disabilities. Oh my gosh, you could become, or I could become, a disabled person tomorrow. And we grow up with things like the Bible that truly have not represented disabilities well. But more important, in general, we teach our children to fear real difference, and disabilities are one of the biggest differences that we tend to really teach children to be afraid of. I mean, look at race. Race was certainly feared, and it still is in so many quarters. It's a process that's slowly evolving, but disabilities is nowhere near there. And you're right, it's all about the conversation, and we need to just become more proactive at including in the conversation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's so true. I feel like the other thing, and I guess I'd be curious about your opinion about this too, is that sometimes there's this tendency, especially if it's a more visual disability, to the first tendency is that people feel this sort of pity for someone, right? Without knowing anything about what's happening. And and I think that's part of fear. And then that's why people don't say anything, or they like try to avoid it. Like, oh, I'm so sorry for them. I don't, something bad happened to them. Right. Like, well, how do you know?
It's what we're taught, though. It is what we're taught. For many years, the Gallup Polling Organization, in surveying people's fears, said that blindness was one of the top 5 fears in the country. Not even persons with disabilities, but blindness, because sighted children grow up believing eyesight's the only game in town, and they carry that forward. And it's not. Like I said, the problem for all of you is that you're light dependent. So your eyesight's great until there's a power failure, unless you happen to be where there's a flashlight, or you can turn your iPhone on, or your cell phone in general, and have a flashlight. But the bottom line is you still need to turn on that technology to get a light. Without light, you don't function very well.
Yeah.
And so why should it be different for you than for me? And we just haven't gotten to the point of truly evolving the conversation to recognize that we all have challenges, we all have gifts, and we can all use different kinds of technologies to accomplish the tasks.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, I think about people who turn 40 something and they all of a sudden need like reading glasses, right? And for some people that is a big transition. It's like, oh my gosh, I need reading glasses. Like,
or more important, they fear turning 40.
Yes.
And then a lot of them turn 40 and discover it wasn't a big deal after all, or 50,
Right.
So it's an interesting world we live in, a dichotomy of a lot of different kinds of attitudes.
It is. Yeah, we have, I mean, in some ways we have a lot of work to do around it, but it doesn't have to be, it could, if we can have conversations with people and be open to learning, then it doesn't have to be hard. It can be uncomfortable, but it should lead to a better place, right?
Oh, sure. Well, for you, with Right on Race being Right on Race, did you hold more community engagements and so on after 2018? I would have thought that certainly with the whole thing with the George Floyd situation and so on, that was an opportunistic time for real discussion.
Yeah, we did. It's been really well received. It's been used in a couple of the book itself has been used in a couple of graduate classes. And we haven't been able to get anyone to do another 2-year engagement, but we've done things like 3 months or 6 months. So we've done them with a lot of with some nonprofits and some higher ed organizations. We've done it with a couple of for-profit. During COVID, we did a special COVID, obviously online session for I think it was 6 or 8 weeks, where we talked specifically about some of the issues around COVID. And we are currently working with the Minnesota Humanities Center to do a statewide project in kind of four outstate metro areas. And so we've done one of those, which is in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and then we're going to be starting another one this fall, and then there's two more. So it's going to be it'll be a few years, but those efforts are lasting about 6 to 8 months too. So again, it's really more about helping, just providing another way for people to have these conversations with one another, build community. And I think you mentioned George Floyd, and one of the things that I think that revealed among so many things is that in Minnesota in particular, we have some real challenges, and a state that, in some ways considers itself very liberal and, so would kind of above the fray, we really aren't. We're having the same issues in Minnesota, and sometimes worse than they are in any other place in the nation. And so for people that weren't aware for a number of reasons, it really made some people stop and think about what they didn't know about what was happening. And so, not only our work, but others' work really in Minnesota was very important and vital. And some of that work continues, and some of it has waned, unfortunately. But it was, an opportunity for some people to realize, okay, maybe Minnesota's not this utopia. Of course it's not, right? But like, oh yeah, okay. So
how disappointing.
yeah, right. I'm living comfortable, and I didn't know these things were happening, but they certainly are happening. And so, yes, it's been really a helpful tool. And we have enjoyed meeting lots of people and helping them to engage in these conversations using the process, and just happy that they're having the conversation. But again, there's much work to be done, and many need to be involved in that. So,
well, being a Prairie Home Companion fan, I have to ask, have you started a program yet in Lake Wobegon?
We have not.
Well,
but we should probably look at that.
You should. I would think that you could get them to think. They're pretty closed in a lot of ways, but you could get them to think and grow. That might be interesting.
It might be, yeah. Do some
accessible more ice fishing.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Over some hot dish.
Yeah, right. And, go to the Ink Fist home, and the church can sponsor many things.
That's right.
So for you, you're doing a lot. What's something you're not good at? Just to ask, just to be spiteful and.
I'm not good at a lot of things, but So one of the things, and this is kind of joking and thinking about like engaging with people. I'm not good at like hiding my emotions and like holding my face. Like if I'm really curious about something or I don't like it, I have an immediate reaction. So actually having to wear a mask all the time during COVID was probably good for me, because I was able to react without people necessarily know. And if you know me well, then you can, even when I'm trying to hide it, you know that I'm thinking something or I'm reacting to something. But that's just something kind of silly. But I think there's just so much. I am a really curious person, and I like to learn things. I wish that I had skills like around carpentry. I would love to be able to create something with my hands in that way. I would love to learn another language. I've tried to learn French, and I know a little bit of Spanish, but I guess I haven't committed myself enough other than taking some classes in college. So I would love to do that. I think, there's a lot of things that I could learn or do better. I think we can always just be better people. I try to be a really good person, but I try to be to learn every day about, this conversation with you about blindness has really already got me thinking. And so I'm always like, oh, okay, there's always something that we can do better. And I don't think of that as a negative thing. I just think that we grow and change all the time as people. And so, we shouldn't get stuck, and we should always be willing to improve ourselves in most of the time, that they're in smaller ways, not necessarily in big life-changing ways. So I could find a number of things that I'm not very good at. That's not a problem for me because, we're always our worst critics.
Yeah. Well, so during COVID, did you win more poker hands because you had to wear a mask?
I did. I won a lot
There,
of arguments.
see?
Our school district was plagued with those school board meetings that were, had people showing up, throwing around conspiracy theories and accusations. We had all of it, taping us and our district appearing on Fox News a couple of times. And so I'm a member of the cabinet, which is the leadership team, and we have to sit kind of not in front where the school board sits, but kind of off to the side altogether. And when some of the people would come to the front to speak and make accusations and sometimes personal, having a mask on allowed me to say a lot of things under my breath that would not have been appropriate if I didn't have it on, but it allowed me to stay in the meeting um, and be able to, I won't say tolerate, but be able to sit there, do my duty without like losing my mind and like responding right in time to some of the things that they were saying. So a mask was a good thing for a lot of reasons.
I understand the feeling well. I play cards, not often anymore, but I learned to try to kind of keep my face straight when I was playing. But I understand exactly what you're saying, and certainly with a mask, it would make it a lot easier, no question.
Right. Yes. Then you have to learn not to like use your eyes, right?
Yeah.
Like, because they're very, full of expression too sometimes. What did you play? Did you play poker or did you?
Poker a little bit, and then my in-laws played a game called Liverpool, which is kind of
Oh,
I think a rummy oriented game. It's a
okay.
lot of fun. We always said that my mother-in-law cheats because she usually won, and so we always said she cheats.
So she cheated.
She didn't really, but it was so much fun to tease her because
Right.
she was just good at it. It was a lot of fun. Well, you work with a consulting group called Love and Struggle. Tell me more about that, if you would.
Yeah. So, again, all this is all related to the Right on Race. So we started all that before we formed the company, but then we realized that once we were going to write the book and then use the format in other places, hopefully, at the time we were hopeful around that, then we decided to come up with the actual company or LLC so that we could do some of that work as formal consultants, because people would be asking for that. But the name Love and Struggle comes from my colleague's father. Actually, he was a part of a lot of the work in the Milwaukee area when he was a young man and part of the struggle. And it's really sort of speaking to the fact that doing at that time really what was more about that kind of the Black Power movement. It was that there is going to be struggle to try to get some equality, but that, it comes from a love for all people, especially your own people, but other people as well. And that how important it was to always kind of keep that balance and keep that in mind in order to make some strides with the work that they were trying to do. And so it still seems appropriate at this time in many ways that, it's really about how do we, in general, for the most part, the things that we're talking about when we talk about race and racism is not about any one individual person. I mean, we see some of that occasionally. That's not the biggest concern. It's really more about the systemic and institutional racism. So, like this work is not about dividing people. It's really about coming together. And so we're going to struggle through some things, but we're going to do it with some love so that hopefully when we get out on the other side, we're going to all be whole. And so that's kind of the approach that we take. Like, when we work with groups of people, we are not trying to, again, we want them to be uncomfortable for that growth, but we're not trying to tear anyone down. We want them to be effective and to, you know, be a part of making this world just a better place. So that's really kind of where it comes from, and speaks to the approach that we try to have when we do the work that we do.
Do you think that there are a lot more efforts to kind of tear down that sort of a concept and not promote love as much as we should? I mean, when we look at all the stuff going on in politics and everything else, it seems like there's a lot of places where love and trust and such are under attack.
It does seem like it, right? Even sometimes from the religious space, where, like, wait a minute, I thought religion in you know, for some people, Jesus or whoever their sort of their God or savior is, like, that's supposed to be about loving and caring for people, and sometimes it's used in a different sort of way. But you know, I'm sure that they wouldn't say that that's what they're doing, but that's sure how it feels when you hear them talk and see the actions that they take. And you know, we just don't, that's really unfortunate, because we don't have time for that. Because, you know, whether it is race or gender or disability or a whole host of, you know, there's no shortage of things that we could be talking about. What people generally need is just more, we all just kind of need more sort of caring for and some grace, right? Because it's hard out here for people. Most people, almost everyone, I would venture to say, is struggling about something and having a hard time. And you just don't know what people are experiencing. And so, you know, you're asking them maybe to do one more thing, or to learn something, or to undo some beliefs and values that they were taught as young people. And it can feel really hard and scary, and they're fearful. And so if you can do that without, you know, being mean and feeling like people have to hate one another, then I think it's just so much more effective and healthy. But there's a lot happening right now that feels really horrible and ugly and hurtful. So
yeah, there is, and it's so unfortunate. I think you really raise some good points about that, and we really need to work harder at stopping the hate, stopping promoting the hate. And as you said, churches may, and people at churches may say that's not what we're doing, although it feels like that's what they're doing. And if it feels like that's what they're doing, then they need to listen and recognize maybe that is in fact what they're doing, or enough people feel that way that the messaging is all wrong.
Exactly. Right. Because it doesn't, you know, it's sort of that intent versus impact thing. If that's the feedback that you're getting, and that's how people are feeling, then that's important, because that's the lasting impression on them. So you might want to reevaluate what you're doing if you really care, if that's really not what you're trying to do. And I'm not convinced that that's not what they're trying to do sometimes.
Yeah.
But you know, that's what they most won't admit that. But I also feel like there's more people that will admit that nowadays, for, you know, a number of reasons. There's sort of a new emboldenedness around being hateful. And it's to me, that feels very scary, because it's like, okay, well then what happens next, right? And so, and I try not to really live and think that way, but I also am not. I also try to be realistic too. So,
and that's fair, and that is certainly something that we have to do. You know, I was just thinking about the conversation we had, and the whole idea of having conversations about disabilities. And if I were to sum up part of what we need to do in one sentence, it would be, we have to get people to understand that since we're changing words and definitions all the time, disability has to stop meaning not able or a lack of ability, because it has nothing to do with a lack of ability. Yeah. So there's a thought to think about, but we've got to really, you know, move forward.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the term? I've heard this used, you know, people will try out different terminology or names, but differently abled is what I've heard people try to use sometime. Do you feel like that's more appropriate, or?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a gross term. How am I differently abled? The ability is
what, right?
Yeah, the ability is the same. Again, it gets back to using different techniques to do the same thing. But women oftentimes do things using a different way or a different technology than men. Left-handed people do things in a different way than right-handed people do, but we don't call them differently abled.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that we've got to stop dancing around the fear. And the reality is disability doesn't mean a lack of ability. All it means is we may do things in a different way. And again, I think it's important that we all recognize that everyone has a disability. I still stick with the light dependence idea because the fact is you don't do well without light, which means Thomas Edison came along and gave you a light bulb so that you could see in the dark. But until then, it was a lot harder. And now technology makes that even easier, doesn't change the fact that that's still what's going on. So the disability for you is as real as the disability for me, except that yours gets covered up because there's a whole lot more technology, because there's a whole lot more of all y'all than there are of me. Doesn't change, though, the fact. And so we've got to stop trying to make up terms that really don't help the problem at all.
Yeah.
And
maybe it's just better to be more specific about what we're talking about, right?
Well, and the fact is that, again, it goes back to everyone. And so we really need to just learn to be more inclusive.
Yeah.
What's one thing you'd like people to remember about you?
There's a saying, I don't remember who says it. Maybe there's I've read it in a number of different ways, but that notion about people will remember how you made them feel, like not what you said to them, but how you made them feel or how you treated them. And so I try to really kind of live in that way. I don't even pretend that everyone is always going to like me, but I don't ever want anyone to sort of engage with me or encounter me and feel like I treated them badly, right? Or was even dismissive of them, even if it's brief. Just trying to be respectful of people and kind. And so I think that's what I'd like to always leave people with, even if whether it's a short sort of encounter or a longer, more established relationship, whether it be around work or whatever. I just think that that's really important, and more than anything is we just, again, I mean, I feel like I've said this a few times, but it really is how we take care of one another. And so I'm a bit of an empath. And so I want other people to be happy, especially if I care about them, but just in general. And I like to feel good. And so I want other people, however they need to feel good, I try to be a part of that rather than creating more chaos or problems or stress for them. So
cool. I think that's as good as it gets. Well, if people want to reach out to you or learn more about you or any of the programs that you're dealing with, how do they do that?
Probably the best. I mean, I am on social media, so I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter for the time being. But probably the best way is to reach me by email. And we could probably share that out some way, but it's pretty simple. It's SWELLMN, like the abbreviation for Minnesota. So swellmn@gmail.com. That's probably the best way, but otherwise on social media as well.
And where's the book available?
So we do have a website, or if you just Google Right on Race to be Right on Race, or Google Love and Struggle, you can purchase the book right online. And there's
did you
also
self-publish it, or did you have a publisher do it, or what?
Yeah, we did self-publish it. So we put it all together, and we did it in probably about 3 months. We kind of took all of the information we had compiled for the effort, and then we wrote some intro pieces, updated some things, wrote a closure, put it all together, and self-published through a very small printing press in Minnesota here, and put it online. So
is it available electronically as well?
We are working on that. We're working with a graphic artist she's probably about halfway with that. So we're hoping to have that available soon, as well as some other books that we're working on writing. So that is one of the things both of us really enjoy doing is writing. It takes a lot of time though, right? So if you have other work, you don't get to it as quickly as you'd like. But yeah, so more to come in that area.
Well, as you're dealing with graphic artists and you're dealing with pictures and other things for the book, be sure to make them accessible for those of us that aren't going to see them. And if you need help with that, I would love to find ways to make sure that becomes accessible for you.
That would be great. Yes, we've been trying to make sure we do that, but it would be great to have someone that has a lot of experience with that, because I feel like we're sort of doing the best we can. So yeah, it would maybe you could be our professional in that area. That would be awesome.
Well, Stacy, thank you once again for being here. And I want to thank all of you listening out there. Thanks very much. This podcast is for you. We really hope that you discover as you listen to these episodes that you are probably a lot more unstoppable than you think you are. And I am convinced that all of us are more unstoppable than we think we are. And again, thanks for listening. Love to hear your thoughts about today. Please reach out. You can contact me at Michael H.I., Michaelhi, at accessibe, accessibe.com. Or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. But wherever you're listening, however you get the podcast, we would really appreciate it if you give us a 5-star review and give us all your feedback and your comments. Stacy, for you and all of you listening, if you know of anyone else you think we ought to have as a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, I would love to hear from you, and we'll work on getting your suggestions on as guests. So I appreciate that very much. So once last time, Stacy, thank you very much for being here and coming on with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really appreciated talking with you today.